Hey guys, what's up? I am John Merritt from BornToProduce.com, a Steinberg certified training center. And in today's short lesson, we'll be looking at 9 ways to make sure your kick drums are sounding fat and delivering that floor stomping goodness that we all strive to get. Of course, making a big fat punchy kick is about more than just processing the kick on its own, but we'll get to that. Okay, so firstly, if your kick is really not working, then it's probably a lot easier and more productive just to pick a new one that suits your track better. However, if you're totally in love with the one kick, then here are 8 more ways in which you can fatten up your kick drum. But do remember that picking the right sample to start with is more than half the battle of getting a nice fat sound. Okay, so EQ. Your kick can usually be broken down into sort of 3 main frequency areas, or 2 of those being the most important, and that is the sort of low energy, the sub of the kick, and the mid energy. A neat little trick to boost the low energy is to first, if you can, turn on linear phase. This just stops any sort of nasty phasing artifacts from happening. We want a peak EQ, and we're going to boost around about sort of 50 hertz. Now, if we just do this with a sort of standard peak EQ and we're boosting around there, or even using like a low shelf EQ, it very, very rarely ever works. I've never managed to get that to sound decent. It just sort of muddies up the low end of the kick. So what you want to do is actually change this into a very sharp peak, something much more akin to this. And normally around about the sort of 50 hertz mark is the area that you want to be boosting in. The knock, or the body of the kick, which is usually the sort of most prominent and defining part of a kick, can be anywhere around about 700 Hz to 2.5 kHz. And you can boost in this region to make the knock more pronounced. And a more gentle sloping EQ would be used here rather than a sharp peak like what we've done with the sub. Okay, so compression. In this sense, it is to dynamically shape the kick. My general process is to set the ratio around about the 3 sort of mark, and I'm going to start with 0 attack, although we're going to be tweaking that in just a sec. No hold, and I want a very quick release around about a sort of 100, just over 100 milliseconds, between 100 and 150 suits most kicks I found. And then we just want to set the threshold. Okay, so at the moment the gain reduction meter is giving quite a big reduction. We don't want that much. We probably want around about -6 dBs in reduction. Now once we got this, then we can start playing with the attack. So as I bring up the attack, you'll notice that you'll start to hear that really sharp sort of transient at the beginning of the kick. And we can use the attack knob to tune the sort of sharpness or the impact of the initial hit of the kick. So you can hear it's made it much more punchy. Now the way you sort of tell is, or what you're really doing here is you're changing the balance between the initial hit of the kick and the tail of the kick. So you can hear when it's bypassed, the tail is much more prominent. Just note that with this and envelope shapers, which we'll talk about in the next step, you may not always want more of a sharp attack on your kick. For a genre like deep house, for example, you often want a softer sounding kick, and bringing out the attack like this will make the kick sound harder, and it may bring the kick out of alignment with the sound or persona of your track. So next up is an envelope shaper. And we can use this just to sort of tweak the dynamics of the kick to get a particular sound. Now really this is sort of similar to what you can accomplish with compression, but without giving the kick that sort of compressed feel. Now you might think that the clean sound you get from an envelope shaper would be more desirable than a compressed sound, but in some cases that's just not the case. I'm not 100% sure if it's because the use of compression is just so common these days that we just accept it more than a totally clean sound, but I personally prefer a compressed kick to an envelope shaped kick. However, that's if I was adding no further compression afterwards. If I was going to saturate the kick afterwards, for example, then I might well want to use an envelope shaper, as the combined compression from the compressor and the compression from the saturator would just be a bit too much. So better to have a clean sound going into the saturator and then shape it afterwards if needed. Okay, saturation. As covered in the mixing with saturation tutorial, we can use saturation to fatten up a kick quite nicely. Now, saturation has the effect of making the sound a little harder or more intense, and this can really help your kick cut through the mix. But beware, if you do use too much, your kick's going to start sounding too hot, and it will stick out like a sore thumb. And you can just hear when I peak it too hard, it just starts deforming the actual kick sound. Now it's just taking it too far. It's too hot. So a balance there must be struck. But you can hear it just makes that kick just more intense. And that will help it cut through the mix more. Just be aware that when you are saturating something, you are compressing it. So you may well need to add an envelope shaper or a compressor after the saturation effect to liven the dynamics back up. Not always the case, but it sometimes is. Also, on some saturations like this one, we have a character dial. And this can be used to boost either both the highs and lows. That's what this fat setting does. It's boosting slightly the highs and the lows as well. Or you have warm, which boosts mainly just the low end, or you have bright, which of course, which you can hear it just brightening up the high end there. It's basically an exciter, but it does a very good job and adds pleasing characteristics to the added harmonics. Certainly nicer, I find, than just boosting with EQ. Okay, so maximizing or limiting. Now this is not really often considered a normal process to put on the kick drum, and it is of course just a more full-on version of compression. Limiting or using a maximizer will sort of lessen any sharp transients like the attack of the kick and will make the tail of the kick sound much more pronounced if used heavily. And you can hear that it just brings out the tail of the kick, although I must admit in this instance it's not actually affecting the attack too much. So doing this, bringing out the tail of the kick would be the main goal of limiting. It's just another way of shaping the sound. So you would really only use this on a kick where you actually want the tail to sound more pronounced. Okay, so layering. So if your kick is lacking in a certain area, let's say it's got a nice round low end, but it's lacking a bit in the mid-range punch, something similar to that, then we can just pick another kick that has the desired characteristics and overlay the new kick on top of the original. But of course, if we do this, you must be very careful to remove any frequencies that will conflict with each other, particularly the sub bass, as you really don't want any phasing issues with the sub of your mix. So in this case, we just add a low cut, as steep as possible, turn on linear phase again if your EQ has that, just to stop any phasing issues with the EQ, which will be especially prominent in the very low frequencies, and just take out the extreme sub of the kick. And then the best way is just to have it playing, turn down the volume of the kick you're going to add, and then just bring it up to mix in as much sort of mid-range punch or whatever it is into the original kick. And then we go to kicks mixed together. And then of course we've got parallel compression, which is where we send part of the signal of the kick drum through to another group, which has typically fairly heavy sort of effects on. And basically any of the above techniques will work in parallel in this situation. But the beauty of parallel processing is of course that you can be much more extreme with your processing settings and just add in as much of the process signal as you want. So let's say we want to really saturate this kick and add as much fatness as possible and even a bit of compression as well. Now those effects were added to a separate group or bus depending on which DAW you're in. Then all you do is go to your kick track and send the signal to the kick parallel group, activate it, and then we can mix in the boosted signal or the treated signal. Now we can hear there the sort of fatness coming from that saturator plugin, the extra bass is just being mixed in with the original signal of the kick. And that is a great way of boosting your kick as well. And finally, mixing. You might think, what has mixing got to do with my kick being fat? Well, actually a whole lot. In fact, I would go as far as to say that sample choice and mixing are by far the biggest factors when trying to make an element of your mix sound big. As I discuss and show in depth in our mixing masterclass, you have to pick the right elements that work with each other. And then you have to give each element its own space. The kick is never going to cut through the mix and sound fat if it has other elements trying to shout over the top of it. Now, of course, with the kick, that would mean mainly balancing it with the bass line and the sub-bass elements of the track, and using a sidechain compressor to duck the volume of the bass line whenever the kick hits. If you don't do this, you'll either get a double whammy of sub-bass when they hit at the same time, which will totally overpower the rest of the mix, or you'll get a horribly unstable low end as the sub of the kick and the sub of the bass line can cancel each other out. So you'll get all sorts of phasing issues, and ultimately a bad low end mix and a badly defined kick. Okay, so just for an example of that, here's a kick and a bass line. Let's just get rid of that snare for a sec. Okay, so this is without the sidechain. Now, you won't notice the bass conflicting with the kick until it sort of really hits at exactly the same time. And I'll put a little dot up on screen that flashes when that happens. And you can notice that when it does hit at the same time, or at least there's a load of sub energy in there from the bass line and the kick hits, that it sort of just slightly deforms the kick. The low end just doesn't punch through. It takes away from the actual kick. And then when I add a sidechain to it, and the kick is just nicely defined on every single hit. There's no deformation of the kick and no conflict with the sub. Okay, so that's it for this short tutorial. If this has been helpful to you, please do hit the like button and subscribe for more helpful music production advice. And feel free to ask any questions you like in the comment section below. If you want a much more in-depth look and to take your mixing skills to the next level, then I highly recommend that you check out our Mixing Masterclass course, which covers in detail everything from getting the perfect low-end mix in 5 simple steps, to getting a big vocal, a big lead, how to produce a big and believable soundstage, and way more. Just go check it out because I think you'll find it really helpful. Thank you guys and girls for watching. I'll see you later.